Alright, here we have lecture 1.3, Analyzing Arguments. So this will be our last lecture on logic and arguments in Unit 1. After this lecture, we'll start talking about unit analysis. So we're going to look at two types of arguments. We're going to look at inductive arguments and deductive arguments. An inductive argument makes a case for a general conclusion from a more specific premise. A hypothesis supported by repeated observations is called a conjecture. So the tip here is that inductive arguments are kind of pattern-based arguments. So if it's a pattern-based argument, then it's based on inductive reasoning. A deductive argument makes a case for a specific premise from a more general premise or principle. So this is based more on principles plus logic. So let's look at two examples. Example number 1, for months I've purchased lottery tickets daily and I've never won, thus I will never win the lottery. So this is pattern-based. We've observed a pattern of not winning and thus conclude we will never win. This is an inductive argument. All dogs are mammals, German Shepherds are dogs, therefore German Shepherds must be mammals. This is deductive reasoning. It's basically using a subset argument. Right? So it's saying, hey, all dogs are a subset of the mammals. German Shepherds are in the dogs set, therefore they must be in the mammal set. And then the logic there works. So let's talk about evaluating arguments. So evaluating inductive arguments, well, an inductive argument can never prove its conclusion true. It can only be evaluated in terms of its strength. And this is subjective. So there is no objective way of analyzing inductive argument. So, for example, if for the past 3 weeks you notice every single Tuesday your neighbor takes his trash out, therefore you conclude that they're going to pick up the trash on Tuesdays, that's inductive reasoning. You are observing a pattern and drawing a conclusion from that pattern. Now, is that a weak argument or a strong argument? You can debate it. So there are weak and strong arguments. For example, when I moved to Savannah, I observed that Abercorn Street gets very, very, very congested near that Walmart close to campus at around 5 to 6 p.m. Now, why do I draw that conclusion? Well, I've driven out there, 5, 6, 7 times at that time, and it was congested. So since that's happened to me a few times, I then conclude every day at around 5 to 6 p.m. that road's going to be congested. That's another example of inductive reasoning because it is pattern-based. Is that a weak argument or a strong argument? Well, you be the judge. You can debate its strength. You can have strong arguments. For example, it has snowed the past 100 winters in Watertown, New York. So 100 winters in a row it has snowed. Therefore, I argue it's going to snow every winter in Watertown, New York. Now, that's a pretty strong inductive argument. I mean, if it snowed the past 100 winters, it's probably pretty safe to assume it's going to snow next winter. But, it can't ever be certain. You can also have very weak inductive arguments. For example, if I'm out driving around and on, the past 3 occasions someone cut me off, I notice there's a red pickup truck. So the past 3 I can't speak today. The past 3 times a driver cut me off, they were driving a red pickup truck. Therefore, all drivers who drive a red pickup truck are poor drivers and cut people off. That's a pretty weak argument. Alright, so let's evaluate some deductive arguments. A deductive argument is valid if its conclusion follows from the premise regardless of the truth value. It is sound if it is a valid argument and the premise true. So those are two separate things, valid and sound. But they are connected, right? You can only have a sound argument if it's valid and true. So let's look at some arguments, looking at this first example here. So in this first example, all 20th century U.S. presidents were male. JFK was male. Thus, since he was male, he must have been a 20th century U.S. president. This is invalid. Right? It's claiming that JFK was a U.S. president on the basis of him being male. That's not a valid argument. Everything we said there was true, but that doesn't mean it's valid. So just a word of warning here. Just because everything in an argument is true, that doesn't mean it's a valid argument. All right, you can vomit facts all you want. That doesn't mean your logic's good necessarily. Let's look at another example. All 20th century U.S. presidents were male. JFK was a president. Therefore, JFK must have been male. That's a valid argument, because it's drawing the conclusion that he must have been male based on the fact that he was a president and all presidents in the 20th century were male. So that's valid. It's also sound because everything here is true. You may have noticed I specified 20th century U.S. presidents. That's why. We know that in the 20th century, last century, all presidents were male in the last century. Alright, next one, all lions are carnivores. Tigers are not carnivores. Therefore, tigers are not lions. So, it helps to draw diagrams on a lot of these. So, all lions are carnivores. So, draw a quick little Venn diagram showing that. Tigers are not carnivores, so tigers are somewhere outside the carnivore circle. Thus, tigers are not lions. Okay. That is valid. But is it sound? Well, part of the premise is saying tigers are not carnivores, so that is not sound. It's a valid argument, but it's not sound because it's not entirely true. It's basing the argument on the supposed fact that tigers are not carnivores. That's not true. Therefore, that is not... Sorry, one moment here. There we are. That is not a sound argument. It's valid. The structure is good, but the facts are not there. Let's look at example number 4. No math teachers wear shoes. Mr. Roberts is a math teacher, therefore Mr. Roberts does not wear shoes. So let's draw another Venn diagram. So here it's claiming that the set of math teachers is disjoint from the set of people who wear shoes. It claims on the premise Mr. Roberts is a math teacher, so there I am. Therefore I do not wear shoes. That's valid. That is valid. Alright, it's making the argument that I do not wear shoes based on the fact that I'm a math teacher and math teachers don't wear shoes. Okay, that's logic is good, so once we check the structure of the argument, we then turn on the fact checking. So we want to make sure we're keeping our fact checking separate from our evaluation of the logic. So here the logic is good, but the facts are clearly wrong. It's basing this on the fact that no math teachers wear shoes, which is simply false. So this is not sound. So remember, an argument is sound if it is both valid and factual. Let's go ahead and wrap up by looking at some conditional arguments. Is this argument valid? If you are late 3 times and you're fired, Doug has been fired, therefore Doug has been late 3 times. That's invalid. This is actually a fallacy. It's called the fallacy of the converse. All right. Keep in mind, conditionals are directional. Late 3 times implies being fired. That doesn't mean the converse is true necessarily. Being fired doesn't necessarily imply that you've been late 3 times. You may have been fired for other reasons. So let's look at this premise. If you are late 3 times and you've been fired, Doug has not been fired, therefore Doug has not been late 3 times. This one is valid. It's basically the contrapositive. It's basing the fact that Doug must not have been late 3 times because he has not been fired. Well, that makes sense because if he has been late 3 times, then he would have been fired. So it's basing it on the contrapositive. So keep in mind, we mentioned this in the last lecture, every conditional is logically equivalent to its contrapositive. So the contrapositive of that is, if you have not been fired, then you have not been late 3 times. And that is logically equivalent to the original conditional. So that makes this argument valid. All right. Well, that's a wrap up for this lecture. Keep up the hard work. We just got one more lecture, and then it's time for the test. Have a wonderful day.